In order to get started with this, I need to tell you guys that there's sort of a mythology going around that the left brain is all about science and math, and the right brain is all about creativity. There's certainly some truth to that, but my only point that I want to convey to you is that the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain is actually determined by your handedness, not predetermined that the right side's always going to be this and the left side's that. There's a dominance that's selected, either by you or by your genetics, who knows, that makes you choose between one of two hands. And once you choose that, really what you're doing is you're showing the world how your brain's routed. You're already telling the world that, hey, look, I'm left-handed, which means that my left side is actually the creative side, my dominant math side, my analytical side is actually the right. These things are not quite wired like a car where the steering wheel is always on the same side of the passenger seat or on one of the seats. Instead, it's really going to be up to the driver who moves into the car to physically neuro-wire the steering wheel. And it's that wiring, I think, that actually gives you another clue. The fact that we are wiring the brain ourselves kind of showcases to you that the brain itself is not a blueprint, sort of like a strip mall that has predefined outlets in it, that it's up to us to build the infrastructure inside our car that's going to suit us best. And this is important. If we didn't do it this way, the moment one of us has a problem, one of us has a genetic sort of curveball, we could say, that the brain knows how to adjust and build around that. In fact, it's quite profound. As much credit as I want to give the brain, way to go brain, it's also really, really misunderstood as far as what its true function is, and more importantly, how much authority it actually has. I think you're going to be really surprised by how little authority the reasoning center of the brain, what you call your conscious mind, actually has over your decisions, that most of those they're actually not your decisions, but you think they're your decisions because your brain is making those decisions. Your brain is deciding how important it is. But we'll get to that. Before that, I just need you to quickly know that the entire sensory homunculus and the motor homunculus are located right in the middle of your brain. They're not pushed to the back. They're not pushed to the front. All your controls are basically circumventing a central core to the very, very center. And these central cores are going to decide what kind of motor systems you have, but also what kind of sensory systems. And as you wrap yourself around the outer edges of the brain, you see the various sense organs that each of them detail. In fact, you'll notice, wow, look how much the lips are. Look how much room is given to the lips. Look how little room is given to the back, but look how much room is given to the arm, right? So basically your arm, your forearm, and your upper arm have less spatial sensory input than your face does. Your face is far more important when it comes to sensing than your arm is, and that's another clue. When you watch that, it's giving you more clues that primarily humans are facial creatures, sensory facial creatures. Touch and taste and all of our senses are pretty much the dominant factors in our brain. In fact, if you look at here, most of the brain is completely focused on your head. And look how much of it's focused on your fingers versus, say, the rest of your body. These are clues. It's giving you information about what's important. Now, every single thing that you have is run by neurons. And there's certainly different types of neurons. You have your multipolar neurons, your bipolar neurons, and your unipolar neurons, but every single one of them functions in the same way. One job of a neuron is to actually traverse a span, to actually reach from one place to another. That's why all your neurons are typically long and white nodules that you see, these nodes here that you see here, those are actually meant for spatial distancing. It's very much like if any of you have seen a router repeater box or maybe a really long USB cord, you'll see that in the middle of that USB cord is a little piece of plastic. And inside that piece of plastic is basically an amplifier. Someone in the chat's right now going, no, James, it's a coupler, blah, blah, blah. But it's basically an amplifier. It's there to amplify that signal, and that your neurons have the exact same framework. These neurons are digital transfer stations of information, and they all do the same thing. They manage the release and the acceptance of sodium and potassium. It's what you and I call a neurotransmission. And actually, it's more of a chemical exchange. It's swapping sodium and potassium is the same way that you send messages, and every single input that you have in your body is basically going to come down to, hey, potassium, I'll give you some sodium if you be good. And the potassium agrees, and that is communication. Much like the internet has a TCP/IP connection, you have a potassium-sodium connection. It's how you spread information through your body, and this is very, very much a digital signature, as you're about to see. These sodium and potassium neurotransmitters control everything through action potentials. Now, when I say everything, there's about 3 senses in your body that actually do not function purely by the action potential, but instead function by the potential of the action potential. That basically it's the permeation of pores, of openings on your skin, and that permeation runs just like a circuit would, where it's measuring the distance between those and the pressure required for either the follicle sensor or like a hair sensor. There's like 3 different kinds of sensors that aren't quite purely action potentials, but their ending signal does turn into an action potential. And that's what we're talking about right now. Your skeletal muscles, your cardiac muscles, action potentials. What is an action potential? It's a millivolt signal. It's an electrical ping. That electrical ping is actually sodium and potassium. Okay, it's just going to show us, we as humans trying to look at ourselves will notice that sodium potassium is actually an electrical circuit. Keep in mind that most of the people that are alive today believe that the body is a hydraulic machine. They're rejecting the idea that there's an electrical signal at all. In fact, with the invention of the neuron, they are still in that thinking mode of, no, but it's still hydraulic. It's sodium, potassium, it's chemical, hydraulic, things like that. However, as we've started to understand the true neurosignaling of the brain, we find that it's made up of agencies, and that there are metacircuits that happen that rely on an electrical impulse, a matrix impulse that's happening on a meta level. So the neurons themselves do not actually understand what's happening or if they do, they're not telling us how, because we see no mechanism for them to understand, actually happening on a broader scale. That system-wide, there will be a wave of electrical potentials, and that wave of electrical potentials will cause synergistic conglomerates that allow certain nerves to communicate with each other. And when these synergistic conglomerates, that's a word I made up, it's not scientific, but when those conglomerates match their prize, when they find their bounty for the brain, they're given a signal, and if they're the fastest at transferring that signal, they're rewarded with light. They physically work for light. They are working for the light, which is a beautiful analogy. Your system learns which ones to rely on based on the speed and the effectiveness and the accuracy of these agencies competing for your very, very limited resources of light inside your brain. These axioms will go so far as to stretch, to move their endpoints purely for that matrix electrical system to manifest in them and for the signal to be clean. It's a fascinating look at like a bunch of neuron surfers on an ocean that are waiting for different currents to come in and will dump their potassium and sodium messages with these currents sometimes to send an even larger signal. Every one of these signals, though, is profoundly simple. Profoundly simple. It's an action potential. It's a millivolt signal, as much as sometimes 50 millivolts tops. It's about it. And a skeletal muscle is a really quick bleep, and a cardiac muscle is more of a bleep, but it's the same thing. And your brain's able to process these things based on the time potential of the signal itself. It's not actually looking at the pure weight of the signal because your body's digital, which is what's kind of I want you guys to grasp. It's more looking at the on-off, 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 on-off nature of it. Basically, every neuron's going to be a 50-volt trigger. And those triggers are going to be within a certain time threshold. The more triggers that you have, the more sensory information you're receiving. If you were to smash your thumb with a hammer, the AP potentials would be, they'd be going like crazy. If someone was to be petting your shoulder, the action potentials would be slower. And that those are the only two things. The speed itself of the action potential is the only differentiation. It's the only one. But when you multiply that by all the different sensory organs, when you multiply that by the complex system that it has, we are able to extract and formulate what's happening to us by nothing more than a binary blip, a simple signal. Here's more. It's an onset responder. You'll see it has a very high millivolts at first, just over 30 and 40. You'll see another sustained responder. It's sending you the same voltage signal, but over a short milliseconds, it's sending as many as 7 or 8 responses. Then you have a burst responder, which is 3 very, very fast bursts, intermittently spurs to really, really convey the idea. So your body would be listening to these, and keep in mind your brain's going to know how many signals you put out is also indicative of how much sodium and potassium is going to be required to even send that signal, which kind of gives you an idea already. You know that the signals that are least important are not going to be burning so many calories to send. It's a lot like blockchain. Believe it or not, your body runs a lot like blockchain because you were spending a little bit of Ethereum to send someone else Ethereum, and what you're spending is going to be the gas for that transaction to go through. If you guys don't use blockchain, but you're still using fiat money, it's your ATM fee. That $3 charge that they want for you to get out your own money from a bank that you already have that's right there in front of you, yeah, that's an action potential that has a tax on it, which is why your body tries to formulate a relationship with these things to lower its fees, right? To keep its fees down. Your body's always working to be as efficient as possible. There are different durations of AP, as we said, spike potential, plateau types, and pacemaker types, but they always correspond to that 50-ish millivolt signal. As I said before, all these things are binary. The entire system is binary. Now, so far this sounds really easy, but I need you to understand that these binary signals are millions and millions of different neurons telling you the same thing. And this brings up our first problem. Time. I only know this because I work in computers, or I used to work in computers. And that if you have a server in Germany and a server in America, and both people are trying to push their bid on for that Beanie Baby, someone wins. And the largest problem, the biggest clue that the body has, is how it routes these time signatures. Now on an internet, how that works is the Russian server and the Chicago server don't actually pay attention to their specific time. They're sending universal time. They're sending something very different. And these are the two different factors of time. Factor one is local time. In a computer, local time is measured with a CMOS inverter circuit. A crystal is placed inside between two charges. A small charge is placed between that crystal, and the amount of oscillations that crystal gives back as a result of that signal are counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8. 38,000 blah, 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 something signals a second from a microcrystal. These are actual crystals. When people try and say, well, New Agers don't know shit, literally every single thing that we have in technology runs off crystals. It's kind of funny how it works that way. But technology is crystal power. It is. And this is just one example. Now, that's just the first part of time. Stay with me. One element of time is just counting. And it's accurately counting 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000, 6, 1,000. So that's time, but it's a progression of time, okay? Something else is required. There's something else far more important. Synchronized time. Synchronized time. Now, in a computer, synchronized time is actually handled outside the body. It's handled outside the circuit. What do I mean by that? It's the network time protocol. Synchronized time is when every single organ in the body would ask a central something. Hey, man, what time is it? What time is it? I think it's this time, but the spleen says it's this time, and the liver says it's this time, and the lungs say it's this time. If we were a computer, that's how it would work. The server in Vegas is competing for what it thinks is the right time with the server in Chicago. Both systems are reporting what they think the time is, and both those are going to actually yield to an authority over what the actual universal exterior time is. So, if you do the math, even though the guy in Russia hits Bye Beanie Baby and the guy in Chicago hits Bye Beating Baby, both of those people locally inside their system only know how many times the crystal has oscillated since the computer came on. Without knowing the universal time, they don't know what to add those crystal oscillations to determine what universal time is actually showing right now. But they don't have to know. They don't. Because all they're doing is submitting a bid for a Beanie Baby. They're going to wait until the master server kicks it back and say, Russia, you won the Beanie Baby. I'm sorry, Chicago. You were 1.7 milliseconds too slow. And that those milliseconds themselves would have no way of knowing themselves which one inherently came first and which one inherently came last. There's nothing in the potential signal, guys, to show them that. There's nothing in this signal that gives any data about time. All it is millivolts. All it is potassium and sodium. At no point does this potassium ball, right, come in and say, hey man, the time is 4 o'clock and I would like for you to have some of this sodium. Oh, potassium, take it. Take it like, yeah. There's no time is transferred in this information, which is really, really what the big clue is. How does it know? How the fuck does it know? Now, if you look up this topic, they don't even talk about it. Anatomy doesn't even discuss this issue for the most part. We'll bring it up. There's definitely times talked about in the body, but this universal clock time, I think, is missed by most physiologists because they don't work in computers. They don't actually think about these time sequence problems. Let me give an example. Your eyes are closed, you're using the force, and you were feeling the softest boobies you've ever had when you were 15 years old. It doesn't matter. As you are touching something, your sensory gland, the sensors that are picking up your touch are going to have to transmit a signal from this part of the finger all the way up the arm and into the brain. And the amount of time it takes for that signal to get to the body is unknown. The tip of your finger doesn't know, well, there are 16,378,000 cells between me and this. There's 16.4, I'm making these numbers up. There's 16.4 thousand nodes. There are 16, why do I keep saying 16? There are 1.6 million terminal. It doesn't know. It doesn't know. All it can do is send that signal. More importantly, when that signal comes into the body, it doesn't have a timestamp on it. It doesn't. Now, the brain could certainly say, well, hey, I got the left-hand signal first, James, so no problem. We don't need time. I'll just simply take which signal I have first. But it doesn't work that way. There are people that will have an accident and their body is forced to regrow. You grow as you get older. A 3-year-old might have a spatial understanding of how long it takes a signal to get from the tip of his finger to his brain, but the next day, there's 1,000 more cells that weren't there before. There's 10,000 more cells that weren't there before. Not only that, the ones it was using last time, half of those are dead. And it doesn't have the ability or the resources to count, to measure. It doesn't walk in with a measuring tape. Yeah, I just need to see how long it is to get from here to central processing. It doesn't know that. And there's the rub, my friends. That's the big clue right there. There's not a timestamp attached to these signals. Nowhere. Now, there's definitely something that keeps time in your head. But it's not able to do it for every cell. There's not a connection to that. And we're going to get to this organ in a second. Before we talk about that organ, I want you to know that even sight and sound are known to be out of sync. That your body will respond either positively or negatively if sight and sound are throttled in a different way. If the sound is played a little bit sooner than the vision, comprehension actually goes up in some cases. So your body is proving what I'm saying, that different signals come in at different times, and it's going to be better or worse at interpreting these signals depending on which one comes first. Those maps that come into its system have to be stored, have to be determined somewhere. Somewhere. But where? Where? This conscious delay is another problem. You have a conscious delay. Our earlier evidence had indicated that a substantial duration of appropriate cerebral activity, up to about 0.5 seconds, is required for the production of a conscious sensory experience. This means the sensory world has experienced delays with respect to real time. Your conscious thoughts are roughly half a second behind what's actually happening. Sometimes it's as much as 0.8 seconds. Now, that's not a problem, because when you look at something, you don't have to look at something the entire time while your brain's making a decision. That a pilot, for example, can look at a gauge for 10 milliseconds, and 2 seconds later, he knows what the gauge said. That he doesn't have to stay staring at it the whole time. So your body even knows it's slow. Your body knows that your mind, your conscious mind, is way the fuck behind. That it is the thing at the back of the bus. It's not at the front driving the bus. It's actually the guy in the very, very back. It's going to be the last to know everything, which is why it's such a huge clue about how consciousness works. Keep in mind, the slowest part of your body is your conscious mind. So, how do we keep it straight? How in the world do we keep track of which neuron came from which station, and who got there first, and which one I should listen to, and more importantly, what is the timing of that signal? A coordinated athlete is going to want to know to the millisecond when he touched the ball versus when he experienced touching the ball. That it would only be him knowing those things that would allow him to succeed, to allow him to beat his opponents. Is his hand-eye coordination, but his hand-eye spatial time coordination is even more important. And if his left hand has 100 cells and 2 neurons more than his right, there is going to be a signal problem. That there's going to be a preference that one arm is going to be faster than the other. And it's a theory, a possibility over why we choose left-handed or right-handedness. I have no paper to show what I'm saying. It's purely my own speculation. But if the body's constantly trying to survive, it's going to be favoring the signals that it feels are getting to it first. That would become something that it would learn to rely on in the future, and maybe even build an entire matrix of navigation around. And that brings us, my friends, to the Eye of Ra, the eye of reality. And I'm calling this the first eye, not your third eye, the pineal gland. The first eye receives all perception long before the senses solving the issue of time, stance, or syncing ever could. That the pineal gland taps into unfiltered source reality. Now, the pineal gland, what is it? It's one of the few unpaired organs in your body. It's not actually a part of the brain. It's actually outside of the blood-brain barrier. Now, which means that it's more exposed to the world itself, believe it or not. It is located in the epiphysis cerebra, And you were told that it controls the endocrine and melatonin systems. I have no problem saying it controls that. It definitely does. In fact, you can look at studies that show how they prove that. Pineal gland senses time. It's able to track 3 different cycles of time: day, season, and puberty. These 3 different cycles are not even routed to the sun. Now, certainly your pineal will sense light, but it has its own clock that's actually even more profound than you sensing light. A pineal transplant, believe it or not, it's capable. We have transplanted pineal glands from one host to the other. I can't find a case where they've described people living, although they say it's not a fatal procedure, but there's no reports on on what happens to these people. And all the rats and all the animals that they tested on, it doesn't work well. But the reason why is because there's something about the pineal that has a built-in rhythm. And when you pull it out of someone else and if you pull out a pineal gland out of someone who's 17 years old and put it in a body that's 68 years old, the pineal gland is not going to be secreting rhythms, circadian rhythms for a 68-year-old. It's going to be secreting rhythms for a 17-year-old. It has its own matrix. It's almost like it was spun up before you were born and decided, I am my own independent timepiece here, which is fascinating because inside your computer, there's a tiny battery. And that little C-cell battery, little hearing aid kind of battery, 5046 battery or 5042 battery, that tiny battery only has one job. And it's to keep that tiny oscillating crystal with enough power so it can keep counting cycles until you turn it on again. So even a computer mimics this same thing, where out of all the sophisticated things a computer does, the only important thing that has to have power all the time is that clock tick, is that sensor that's constantly saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then as soon as it finds out universal time, as soon as it taps into something else, it's able to add those and then get a predictable idea of what time it thinks it is because it has confidence in its own crystal. That's time, my friends. It's as simple as that. Now, these 3 rhythms, science doesn't know how the pineal gland does this. It has no idea. How does it know to track the day, the season, and the puberty? And I've already told you it's not because of light. Yes, your pineal gland will use light sensors. It's actually not located on the pineal gland, but other animals have them. But it actually does attach to retinal sensors. But these retinal sensors have been severed, and the pineal gland is still able to grind out its cycles. Why? We don't know. It's one of the reasons why we stored thousands and thousands of penguin pineal glands a long time ago. Look that up on WikiLeaks. It's really interesting. There's certain animals that have a larger pineal gland. Certain animals don't have one. One of the oldest living animals, the crocodile, excuse me guys, it could be alligator, but I'm pretty sure it's crocodile, doesn't even have a pineal gland. The walrus is pretty much the animal that has the largest of these, but of course it's also biggest. Penguins are a close second. There's something about being further away from the sun that seems to encourage a larger pineal gland. You could say, well, of course, James, it secretes melatonin, and you're right. But again, even in no light, even when it's not even just no light, because you could say, well, they're still interpreting the sun even though the lab is blocking out the light. Right. I'm telling you that they will even move test cases to different geographical areas, and those places are still cycling in their own internal clock. It's an autonomous essence inside the pineal gland. So what is it? It's sand. It's sand. Society calls the pineal gland brain sand. And when you look at it, you see these little brain sand, extracellular lamellated mineralized organic matrix is what they called. But guess what? Melatonin secretion by the pineal gland has been reported to be affected by exposure to electromagnetic fields, EMFs. Second harmonic generation measurements showed that pineal tissue contained non-centrosymmetric crystals, thus proving the presence of physioelectricity. What is physioelectricity? This microphone that I'm speaking into has a diaphragm inside, and that diaphragm is a wafer of crystals. And those wafer of crystals, just like the oscillating clock inside your timepiece, these wavering crystals are listening to the vibrations from my voice. They hit that wafer transmits it and converts that signal into electricity. That's piezoelectricity. It is pressure converted to pulse and pulse converted to pressure, either or. A crystal can output an electrical signal, or it can output a pressure. That's a diaphragm from a speaker and a microphone working in tandem. It's conversion, electricity to pressure, pressure to electricity, piezoelectricity. Your pineal gland is listening to EMF signals that are so subtle that they're able to penetrate the skull. They're able to penetrate all that meat inside your head, all your hair, all your hats, and they're able to reach your pineal gland and signal it. They're able to signal that because of this matrix of diaphragm listeners. Now, a lot of people are told your pineal gland is not activated. James, you got to activate that pineal gland. They'll say, you need to decalcify that bitch. Until that thing's decalcified, you're never going to understand, brah. And all these people believe this shit. And they walk away feeling all sad, going, God, I got to fucking decalcify my pineal gland. And they'll try all kinds of things. And the technology of belief weighs heavy on these things. This bothers me because I think this is a psychotic attempt at disabling your intuition, whether it's intentional or not. To tell someone that, when literally, why does it have to be soft? Why are you under the impression that the pineal gland is supposed to be soft? Well, fluoride, James. I put fluoride in the water because everyone wants to kill us, because everyone's a bad, evil guy. Okay, that's fine. But fluoride is actually considered healthy up to a certain degree. Did you know that? Now, I'm not saying that, well, we all have a safe amount of fluoride. I don't know. You need to check with your local water company. That's why I joined the public works here. I was curious about that. But it turns out that fluoride is actually good for the body up to a certain point. But then from that point on, it's toxic. I'm not saying you need to drink fluoride. I'm trying to tell you that these things you're told about how mute or deactivated or calcified your pineal gland is someone trying to hijack your own body. I remind anyone that was in the Boy Scouts that the word tenderfoot was actually an insult. And in Native American cultures, a tenderfoot was the weak one. It was the one that would not survive on the rocks. And that your pineal gland is not calcified, it's crystallized, because you are a crystal ship, motherfucker. You are riding a crystal ship through this giant ether ocean we call life, and you are not a mushy tenderfoot. The cells inside the first eye are the oldest things in your body, in fact. The oldest cells in your body are inside your pineal. That's your Ark of the Covenant, baby. You are suspended between two cherubims. You could think of the cherubims as a zodiac. Your consciousness is suspended in this earth like the Ark of the Covenant. And that suspension is exactly what happens with your pineal gland. It is suspended in your brain, connected to 12 sacred cranial nerves. And here they are. And they all converge in the central place, right next to your pineal gland, right there, your thalamus too. If anything, they really, really mount into the thalamus, and you'll find that these two work together. Your olfactory, your optic, your ocular motor, your trochlear, your trigeminal, your obducens, your facial, your auditory, your glossopharyngeal, your vagus. We'll talk about the vagus here in a little bit. Your accessories and your hypoglossal. Right, so tongue, shoulders, uvula, taste, hearing, facial eye, eyelids, all that. Now, the pineal is sensitive to lower blue frequencies. You guys have probably heard that. Don't watch that that mobile phone at night, it'll keep you up, right? Why? Because the LED screen has a low-level blue light, and that blue light is bypassing your bones, your cranium, your muscles, your tendons, all that stuff, and your pineal's like, fuck, dude, that dude's like really reading right now. It's sensitive to those lights because they're lower wavelengths. Those lower wavelength lights would be the kind of information that could pass through that you could absorb. Now, your vision could be broken down into 3 different groups: photopic, mesopic, and scotopic. These different types of visions are going to change based on the amount of light in the room. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because I want you to realize that at no point in time do you have any authority to dictate which kind of vision your brain is going to use. There is something inside of you that is turning camera 1 off and turning camera 2 on. And those cameras you could look at as these photopic, mesopic, and scotopic visions. Photopic would be low light, or actually well-lit conditions, right? All your colors, your cones are going to be reading the colors. Your rods are going to be more based on brightness. They really don't focus on color, and because of that, they're going to be more blue shifted. They're going to be towards a lower spectrum of blue light. As you think about your pineal, I'd like for you to realize that your pineal is able to read base light, EMF, through physioelectric crystals, brain sand, and that those brain sands would do just what a diaphragm would do. It would vibrate. And when it's vibrating, those vibrations are converted into an electrical signal that's a neuropulse. And that neuropulse goes somewhere. And where it goes is what you're about to find out. So keep in mind, you don't control your eyes. Something else does. Something that you don't even get to talk to. It's going to tell you when. And as you study the eyes more, you notice that the rods and the cones are always working. You close your eyes and they're still working. It's your brain deciding what it wants to render to you that's reality. It's not what your rods and cones are seeing. Reality is not what your sensors are perceiving. Reality is what your brain renders that they are seeing to you. And this is a very, very, very important distinction. Matthew 6:22. The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, the whole body shall be full of light. This is a profound quote because it talks about how the whole body could be full of light right after it says, if you can see through a single eye. I'm paraphrasing. Seeing through the single eye makes your whole body full of light. And the opposite of light is a chemical called melanin. Melanin, not melatonin. I know that the pineal gland generates melatonin, but I'm talking about melanin. Melanin, the pigment. The thing that science says, well, yeah, we got melanin because everyone's racist. That's what melanin's for. Yeah, it's just here to color the skin so people can call you racist. That's what melanin's for. I'm actually not kidding that science thinks that the purpose of melanin is to color the skin. But it does so much more than that. So much more. And even encoded into some of the deepest, oldest religions, they're hinting at these things. But not only did the Egyptians understand anatomy, but they even understood all the different parts and what they do. You could look at the medulla oblongata here, shown as coming from the base of the eye of the thalamus here, as wrapping down your entire body. And that curl is basically all of your sensory organs. The hypothalamus is hanging, the thalamus is controlling, and above it, your sense of reason is the corpus callosum. But instead, we live in a society where we think brain is king. Those of you listening, the brain names itself and proclaims itself the most important organ. But who truly is driving the boat, my friends? Who? Because your conscious mind, if you're lucky, accounts for 10% of what's going on. More like 5%. Sometimes it's 0.5%. This idea of what you call your reasoning brain, this idea of what you call the intellect, these constructs we've made where there's this absolute objective world of platonic solids that your reasoning brain is reflecting is all mental masturbation done by your brain to try and feel like it deserves this reward. But look deeply, my friends. Look deeply. Because all the most important functions of the body, the brain doesn't trust you with. Your body's like, bitch, I'm not going to put you in charge of breathing. You're going to forget. Are you going to have an epiphany? Are you going to suddenly discover something? You're not going to be able to do this. And your circulation, I can't trust you with that. You're a fucking retard. You're running around sticking needles in people's arms. You don't know what you're doing. Your body understands that your conscious mind is not only not the best at keeping itself running, but is at least, as you saw before, 0.5 milliseconds behind everything else. So why would it be in charge? But you think it's in charge because you, like me, want to feel comfortable. You want to feel like you're the captain of your ship, and you are, but you're ignoring how powerful the engineer is, or you could be. Not only breathing, circulation, but digestion. The constant pushing and turning of muscles, the churning and squeezing of enzymes to break down, that's a science. It's an assembly line. It's work. When you're eating food, you're burning calories because your entire digestive tract is working. It's secreting saliva. It's doing all kinds of things. It's moving all of its forces into the idea, well, this guy ate some pepperonis and we got to fucking digest them. It knows that your captain, your rational mind, is only on the bridge for 16 hours a day. And let's face it, those 16 hours, holy shit. Your body's like, what's he going to do to me now? And, our addictions we have, the bullshit we swallow, the food we swallow, the things we do. The 16 hours are rough for a system that's trying to run despite you. And that's truly what's happening with us so much now. That our bodies run despite us, not with us. Everything important to your survival is off limits to reason. So why are you insisting that reason is running the show? The reason is because it feels better to think that way. But it's not true. Aperture consciousness, my friends. Aperture consciousness. That reality is throttled to you by an unseen force, the same way your digestion, the same way your circulation, the same way your thoughts are regulated and sent to you when you're ready. You have an aperture to this first eye, this pineal gland that's your crystal ship, that's like a record, listening to the perturbations of the reality around it. These low EMF signals are coming in, and they're being processed. And that processing is causing something called aperture inside of you. And your eyes do this. They dilate. If you shine light in my eyes, they will dilate. Right? I'm sorry. Yeah, they will get small, not dilate. They will shrink. If you turn off all the lights in the room, they will dilate. It will open up. Why? Because it wants to collect more light. Your conscious brain doesn't say, open aperture to 16 degrees. It doesn't do that. It's not trusted with those things. It could burn out your entire gallery if it did it itself. It doesn't trust you with that. Something else is in charge of that, something deeper. As I said before, a large aperture basically is just wide open. A small aperture is tiny. Those of you who've given birth, you know what I'm talking about, right? You have a certain rhythm that's going to allow you to pass a very, very large object through a very, very small object, and that's going to require an aperture down below opening as large as possible. And if it's not open, that new reality, the child will not come through. In camera world, f-stop 1.4 would be a fully open aperture, and f-stop 8.0 would be an almost fully closed aperture. And that you could imagine that between each of these apertures that you would be able to see a completely different reality. No, it's a completely different reality, guys. It's not just subtly different, it's completely different. The amount of light pouring in, the amount of color spectrum pouring in, all that stuff's going to completely change the image based on that aperture. It changes reality. This hole changes reality. Look at this. So on the left is f-stop 1.2, fully open. You're losing information. You're seeing a man, you can still tell he has a mustache, but you're losing most of the skin tone on his face. You're losing data because your aperture's so wide open. But on the very, very right, a low aperture, we're also losing data, but on the different spectrum. Now, that lower data is allowing us to see that his tie's yellow, or the fully open aperture, we don't even know what color that is. What we want to be able to see this man clearly is about an f-stop of 4. Really nice, even aperture to give us an idea of what we're looking at. And something is telling you what that aperture is. Why use a small aperture? Why use a wide aperture? If you look at the gray box that say in focus on both of these, you'll see what I mean. A small aperture is going to give you a larger depth of field. That's called depth of field. And a larger aperture is going to give you a smaller depth of field. That depth of field is going to allow you to see or to not see things that are very close together, next to each other. Example, on the left is a narrow aperture. Narrow meaning that even though there's a difference between the word on the left as far as length away from the camera, so for example the word such, railway, or station, such is much closer to the camera than the word station is. And because you have a narrow aperture, all of the letters are clear. But under a wide aperture, you're only going to be able to see clearly that middle word there, railway or expose. That wide aperture actually ends up blurring out the rest of it, but giving you even more details for what you're looking at. So there's advantages to both. There's advantages to both. The amount of light that you take in is the amount of reality that you are processing and are willing to absorb. Now, all of this stuff is not controlled by the brain. It's controlled by the vagus nerve. The Polyvagal Theory was written by Dr. Stephen Porges. I highly recommend it to any of you. It's a very short paper, but he explains in detail how every organ in your body has this vagus nerve wrapped around it. It connects pretty much every system in your body. And these vagus nerves can control the tension or the release, the aperture of your entire system. And by constricting or releasing and constricting and releasing, it's able to throttle you. It's able to control the amount of information, of chemical acceptance you have. Your aperture dilates or constricts based on your polyvagal system. This is a reptilian system. It's not a neocortex system. It's in the pons of your brain. It is in the very, very reptilian core that controls this vagus system. You can see on the left, really, really rough example of sympathetic reaction on the vagal nerve to the ventral vagal to the dorsal vagal. A ventral vagal is I feel connected, I feel great in the world. You may want to look at this as like a relax. So I'm using the word relaxed really loosely here, guys. But I think the analogy holds true, that your nerves will relax, they will loosen, and you will feel connected and safer in the world. The sympathetic nerves will react when danger or when perceived danger starts to come in. You'll start to feel the caution of the system. Your system is slowly tensing. It's putting restrictions on certain things. It might say, hey, stop eating those pepperonis. I just saw a bear. I don't know if he's going to come back, but just shut down digestion right now. Yeah, stop salivating. We might need those energy. We might have to run from this bear. And that your system is regulating where it's going to route this power. A dorsal vagal response at the bottom. I can't cope. I'm collapsed. I'm completely shut down. This would be a fight-flight response, a fear response, that you're so restricted that You can't see. And what happens when you're restricted? You get tunnel vision. You've heard of this. Rapid breathing. Rapid but dense breathing. So limited oxygen. This is your polyvagal system doing that, and your breathing is just reflecting what it's doing. Your vision is reflecting what's happening. That there is something else that has control of you like a joystick, and it's got its fingers wrapped around your heart, your lungs, your liver, your throat. And it is going to give you tension based on the amount of threat that it perceives through eyes that you do not have, which is why it overrides your conscious mind, and you don't get to say things like, vaccines are safe and effective, when really all the organs, your polyvagal system is like, do not stick that in my arm. Just an example. The vagus nerve is psychology. You're speaking, when you're listening to someone nervous as they're cracking their way through a speech, you're watching their polyvagal system communicate. And you're watching their conscious mind do its best to follow along. You're seeing who's truly in charge and who's been in charge the whole time. There is something deeper that's running your system. Now, it's very, very important that you understand that aperture has nothing to do with intelligence. In fact, some of the smartest people you know will have the shittiest aperture you know. Why? Because they are under the impression that this captain, this conscious mind that's roughly 5%, if that, in control, is in charge of everything. And that their intelligence allows that rumor to persist even more. And what happens? Their polyvagal system starts to fight with them. It's why a lot of nerdy kids can't do athletics, because they're not in their body. They're sticking all of their focus and their identity in their mind. They believe their conscious mind is in charge, and so they abandon everything else. But the polyvagal theory says differently. And you see that when they try and ask a girl out, or when they try and do a presentation at work. You're watching the polyvagal theory react to the reality of the situation and who's really in charge. Aperture is not intelligence. Aperture is curiosity. Your natural inclination to curiosity is directly controlled by your polyvagal nerve. It is. In your mind, you're not suddenly feeling curious and then your polyvagal nerve lets go. No. What's happening is your entire system, your engineer, your deeply rooted captain, who's running even when you're asleep, is either sensing danger or sensing safety around him. The safer you feel, the more curious you're going to feel. The more dangerous you feel, the more serious you're going to feel. This is a throttle between curious and serious, curious and serious. That's why most couch therapy doesn't work. You're looking to try and tap into your polyvagus nerve. This is going to be an emotional touch, not a talkie-talkie on a couch touch. It's a very, very different kind of thing to talk to your polyvagal system. Aperture, 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 aperture. All of these are examples of aperture. Let me do that again. The wider the aperture, the more you see. Notice how the background, some of these are kind of stretched, I realize, for cinematic effect. But just by changing the aperture and the zoom on the camera, the entire background changes. The entire scene changes. But the camera doesn't actually move. Believe it or not, right now in this scene from Jaws, the camera doesn't move, nor there, nor here, nor here. What's happening is the focus and the aperture are changing in real time. The dilation of the lens is in direct opposite to the zoom of the lens at the same time. It gives that effect. And that effect really, really demonstrates what aperture truly is, that all of us can be in the same scene, in the same chair, but experiencing a different landscape, a different perspective. Some of us will see men in cars in the background and others won't, and both of us will be telling the truth. Both of us are accurately conveying the reality we see. Why are they different? Because each of us has a different aperture dialed in. That's why. And the reason why we fight so much is because we have this notion that everybody sees things the same way, and they quite frankly don't. That's why you have people that believe in a two-party bipartisan system that had 19 box cutters take out the most sophisticated military in the world with sandals. You have different beliefs because you have different polyvagal theories that are rendering the world as best they can to their drunk retard captain who thinks he's in charge. I do not mean to insult the captain of your ship as much as I mean to say that the engineer is never, ever not on duty. That Scotty who lives deep inside you, that intuition, is more loyal to your ship than you are. He doesn't abandon it, and there's a truth that comes with that, and that is aperture. He has to dial things down to where you will at least watch. The eye is a gallery, not a window. And we have it completely backwards. And it took me studying this equipment to even know. I could not believe that this was true. But we have it backwards, that we think that the eye is out there in this physical objective world receiving data and sending it to our brains, and I'm here to frickin' tell you, my friends, that may not be true. That when you go back to the problem of timestamps, which I told you about, the one way to fix this is if all reality came through a central processor first. And that's why we can't call it the third eye. We have to call it the first eye. Because that central needle playing that record, your pineal gland, is listening first. And these signals that you see in the eye is a signal coming into the eye, into the gallery, and broadcasting on the retinas. James, you're talking crazy. But I'm not. The rods and cones in your eyes, as we said before, work even when you're sleeping. They don't care if the eye is open, which is terrible because the rods and cones burn most of the calories in your eyes. What happens? These things are always on. And because they're always on, these different slots, these little opsums things here on the left, these things actually burn out like a light filament. And they burn out while your eyes are closed. You're sleeping, and your rods and cones are burning out. Light bulbs popping all the time. All the time. All the time. Because your eyes don't give a shit what's actually outside of your eyes. They're responding to what's happening inside the retinal cave. Rods and cones are embedded upside down, guys. Upside down. That this top RPE cell in this document over here, man, I wish I could draw on my screen right now. This top, how come I can't get my mouse over there? In the very top, over on the right, the RPE cells, that area in yellow, that is the embedded, we're going to call it skin of your eyes. And that the actual light bulbs, the things that actually perceive your eyes, are embedded inside the skin. They're not sticking out like a light bulb. They're embedded inside the skin. They're sticking inside the skin, not out. Not only are they sticking inside the skin, but they're sticking inside a very, 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 very important membrane that has one function, and that is the secretion of melanin. Not melatonin, melanin. That your rods and your cones are directly next to a secretion of black ink. The darkest, blackest ink you could find. The most absorbent material we've ever known to man. And it's inside your eye. And it's secreting this squid ink that's covering your eye, stopping it from seeing so much, even though the rods and cones are at full on power and blowing, even though they're lodged inside the eye, that they are completely embedded inside this RPE cell. And when you start to back engineer the eyes, you see how insanely complicated the eyes are if they're supposed to be cameras. That if they're supposed to be cameras, you start to notice, well, wait a minute. Why do you need a camera to converge and cross but only part ways inside the optic chiasma and then go all the way back to the occipital lobe, render a picture, and then, before you even see it, come all the way up through the amygdala and ask permission to show it to you? And that we think we see things, but in actuality, it could be just as possible that we render things in the eye. And if we were to render things instead of see them, it would solve two big problems. Problem one, time stamping. How long did it take for that signal from the rods on my eyes to pass its way through the chiasma back to the occipital lobe, back up again to the amygdala, then to render it, then another half second for my brain to process it? How long? And the answer is you wouldn't know. You would not know. But your pineal would. Inside your head, one central eye listening to EMF signals would have zero issues determining which signal came first, because they all came through the pineal first, before they passed through the amygdala, rendered into the occipital lobe, and finally broadcast up through Plato's cave and into your retinal chamber. Macular vision is the obelisk. These are your cones, they render the color. Peripheral vision is the pool. These are your rods, they're rendering brightness. And that these sensors are triggered by what your occipital lobe tells them to, instead of the other way around. This is completely backwards from everything you've heard. And you need to realize that I am pushing a theory to you. I cannot prove what I'm saying to you. I can simply say that if you start to look at consciousness this way, it solves a lot of physiological problems that we've either ignored or we've claimed we have no idea how that would work. It's something to really, really consider when you think about what consciousness truly is. Now, inside these eyes, there is a gas and a brake. And the gas is dopamine, and the brake is melanin. And that what you see, what you render, will be directly determined by the driver of your car. We've talked about this driver of your car. And if that driver goes too fast, it's going to scare the shit out of you. That you are suspended like Mad Max to the front of the grill of your body. You're stretched out on your cross of mortality and morality. And you were traveling at 80,000 light years a second. And that the amount of brake and the amount of gas is going to either make you feel comfortable or make you freak out. And that system itself is the regulation of reality. Reality. That the gas is dopamine and the brake is melanin. When you are comfortable seeing more things, the RPE cell, this upper membrane, secretes dopamine. And when you are not comfortable seeing things, that dopamine is inhibited and melanin is released, which blocks out what your rods and cones are even able to process. That these two throttles are used in direct relation to your polyvagal theory to determine, can I show James all of reality, or is he going to get really freaked out when he sees this part or that part, right? How much of this is he going to see before he freaks out? Gas is dopamine. And believe it or not, mice without dopamine in their retinas can no longer see. They're completely blind. That there are dopamine inhibitors inside your eyes, and when these inhibitors are activated, that mice will become blind. It's believed that we work the same way, but no one's actually been able to inhibit dopamine inhibitors on the eye yet. Although there's certain conditions that seem to prove that this is true for us too. Meanwhile, brake is the melanin, that inside this retinal pigment epithelium, the RPE, this yellow thing we've talked about, that inside of there are hexagonal cells that are densely packed with granules of melanin. These granules will secrete or retreat based on our polyvagal comfort. That's what determines it. Your reality is painted and covered, painted and covered, painted and covered. Dopamine's paint, melanin's cloth. And it's putting color, watching your reaction, go, oh, too much red, and it blocks out the red. And it does that in a microsecond because it doesn't want you to be a fainting goat, right? You've heard of these goats, right? You scare them and they just fall over. They freeze, their body looks stiff, like rigor mortis sets in, and they fall over. Why? Because they don't have the regulations that we do. They don't have this melanin break gas system. In fact, most animals don't. We're one of the few animals that does have this system. And it's interesting because we're also one of the few that have that outer lobe to our brain. And I think it's a vital part of understanding why this works that way. It has to. That if it didn't, we would faint. Now, this isn't just the eyes. Don't think I was just talking about the eyes, guys. This is every sensory organ. Hearing. Melanin and dopamine throttle our hearing the same way. Ladies and gentlemen, the cochlea, whatever you want to call it, is completely closed system. Closed. Not only is it inside the ear, not only is it inside the inner ear, not only is it behind a barrier of what you got your other shit in there, that bone, that wishbone thing, but inside that, the cochlea, which is sort of like a spiral. If you were to unwind that cochlea, that would give you all of your sound, but then you would also have these three tubes, these three hoops. The reason why that they are on three different axes is because that's your XYZ chip inside your head. What does that mean? It's going to give you your pitch, your roll, and your yaw of your body. And even that, both those systems, your hearing and your pitch, roll, yaw, have melanin. Melanin inside of them. Inside. Not on the outside, on the inside. That inside the cochlea, wrapped inside the chamber, there is melanin. And it is released, secreted, or inhibited based on, they don't know yet, but I think it's polyvagal. I think that our comfort level, it's controlled through the amygdala, determines how that's going to go. And there's definitely proof that the amygdala is the controller of that. Hearing, we have these things called melanocytes. The dendrites, they release this stuff. You can see a picture of it. Pigment stria vascularis. Inside the ear. Not outside. Not even on the inner chamber of the ear where light could maybe go if it bounces right. No. This idea that, well, it's because everyone's racist. That's why we got melanin. It's the most retarded thing I've ever heard. And I'm not saying science says it's because we're racist, but you get it. Everyone says it's just for skin pigment. Well, yeah, pigment. And then they claim, oh, because the sun's cancerous, because this is big. You get it. But there's more. There's more. Because if you think what I told you about the eye is crazy, you're not going to be able to do it after I tell you about blind sight. Blind sight is a phenomenon you will find in every scientific textbook. In PubMed, you'll find research studies on this. You'll find long-term studies on this, whether it be in monkeys and men. Blind sight, the ability to respond to visual stimuli without a visual cortex. Bam! Without a visual cortex. The body is able to respond to light. How the fuck does it do that? Slide A, blind sight positive individual. Side B, blind sight negative. All the systems are still operational. All the systems are still responding and reacting to light. But they shouldn't be. If rods and cones are the things that send the light back into the occipital lobe, how the fuck is it able to light up in an accurate way when there are no rods and cones? And the answer is because the eyes don't see, they render. They render reality. Blind sight is so keen that it allows for spatial detection and emotional detection. The Conscious vision in humans depends on the integrity of a region of the brain called the primary visual cortex. Damage there causes blindness in corresponding areas of the visual field. Long story short, a navigating blind person can walk down a hall and avoid obstacles without having the ability to see them. Now, some of you may want to argue, well, it's a deeper kind of sonar, and I would argue you're probably right, because the EMF signals that your first eye are picking up would be echolocationally based on the spatial landscape around you. In submarines, we call this a sonar. It's a sonar dome. It's a big rubber membrane on the front, and if you know what you're doing, you can put on headphones and you can listen, and you know everything that's under the ocean just by sound. You know shape, trajectory, organic or not. Anyway, blind sight. This is not a just in Tennessee thing. Blind sight is a known phenomenon. Not only is it a known phenomenon, but the eye will still blink and dilate despite having no retinal input. And what's fascinating about blind sight is that monkeys are better at it. Here's a study, Blind Sight in Monkeys by Alan Coden and Sturrig. They basically proved that for whatever reason, monkeys are better at blind sight. And I believe the reason why they're better at that is because they do not have such an outer lobe competing with them. This conscious captain that's like, I'm in charge, even though I was asleep for 8 hours. That having that distraction turned off allows the blind sight to be that much more effective. But humans can get good at this too. It's just that it turns out monkeys are better at it. This reality system is all going to be routed through the amygdala. It's the one part of the brain where all of these senses have to pass through. It's probably the biggest, I'm speculating here, but it's probably the biggest waste of road and of time ever to say, hey, I know that you got some important data, eyes, but I'm going to need you to run it back to the occipital lobe, talk about it, and then bring it back up here to the amygdala, have her check it out, and then if she's okay with it, then we're going to send it to your neocortex, and it's going to decide if something's important. That's what happens. That there is a nun, there's a Mother Mary, the amygdala, Amy. She's there, and she's holding your captain like a baby, and she's feeding it information. And if it's hungry, she gives it dopamine, and you can see a little bit more. And if it gets scared and it's full, he gives it melanin, and it slows down. The amygdala decides what you're going to see. She is the filter for what's safe for you to perceive, and the way your body is able to determine what it's going to see is by the secretion of either dopamine or melanin in the system, right between the eyes. These two pieces of yellow are your other eyes, we'll call them. And they're connected to the thalamus, they're connecting to the central core. If someone doesn't have a thalamus, they're basically completely cut off from all sensory perception, all of it gone. And then what you think is the retinas certainly is the retinas, but if you look right between the eyes, you're looking at the real eyes behind it. You're looking at the amygdala, and she's on the left and the right. She's got both towers covered because she does not want her captain to faint. She wants him to be comfortable. Some of the most complex system in the world is the eyes. And it's all having to be routed through the thalamus, through the amygdala. Again, like I said, back to the visual cortex, and then coming back again. It's a mess if this was purely, I see what I see. It's not that way. In fact, evolution. There are people that will argue, James, the reason why, I can't believe people are this stupid, and they give them doctorates, by the way. But they will say, James, the reason why your eye's on the left and the right side of your brain processes it is because it's faster to move from this side of the eye to here. And when they're telling you that, when they're saying shit like that, they're hiding from you the fact that it has to go back to the occipital lobe first. So this entire idea that it was built this way for evolution survival standpoint proves my point, not theirs. It proves that there's a problem here. If this is purely for evolution, why is it so retarded and going way out of its way, how much time is actually lost? And it's not lost because your aperture is going to have to determine what is too hard of a truth for you to absorb. And if it's too loud of a truth, it will not allow you to render it. Or it will allow you to render it with such a spatial safety net that you feel comfortable perceiving it. So you will see something that maybe was in the past. This is a very comfortable thing we will do. Emotionally, we'll see something used to be there. You will see glimmers of something. You might see a hint. You might see a ghost. You might see a demon. All these things are your body doing the best it can to render the most accurate picture it can without you freaking out and losing your shit. And that's the entire purpose of the amygdala. If you didn't have the... You would not be... I can't even imagine what you'd be, because if you were to remove the amygdala, you basically would have no ability to throttle anything. And I think that you would either explode or turn into one of those dudes that you met that you could tell did like way too much acid. Now he's just like a living frog man or something weird. It's not able to tap into reality because of how loud it is. And you could argue that that's the entire purpose of the amygdala, to make sure it's safe. And the opposite of safe, of course, would be trauma. And that we notice historically that trauma dilates us in certain ways, and that certain types of trauma allow us to see things that we wouldn't want to see, and vice versa. That we will even use these coping mechanisms to deal with the fact that we don't want to see something. We will lie to ourselves through our senses. Aperture dilation. Curiosity opens aperture. We become permeable, not vulnerable. Which brings us to psychosis. They say 1 in 100 of us will experience psychosis, but it's actually much more. The entire definition of psychosis is one's reality doesn't match what a consensus majority thinks it should. And we have fancier words for it. We say when one isn't able to determine what's real, but that's that thinking that there's an objective reality and that you're not able to see it correctly. But none of us are. So who's to say that the consensus reality is the right reality? In fact, we know that's not true. So even our definition of psychosis changes dramatically when you start to look at things through this eye of Ra, through this first eye, the eye of reality. Psychosis becomes a coping mechanism. That you understand why some will see things and others won't, because of aperture, not because of reality. This is Jerry Marzinski. If you want to see an interview with him, I have one on my channel. It's very, very old. Jerry explains there's no such thing as hallucinations, and that what people are describing, a hallucination by definition would be something that is sparse, that is not interconnected. It wouldn't have a timeline. And most of Jerry's patients, Jerry worked in a hospital for 20 years with extreme schizophrenic patients, and that the hallucinations that he was told to document, he noticed weren't hallucinations. They were linear timelines that occurred that he had no explanation for. Jerry had a big enough aperture to absorb these things, to believe his patients, and so he was able to get further than anyone else was with his work. That's why so many respect him. That we ramp from auditory to visual, that we use comfort as a measure for what we can perceive, and that the shadows and the hatred and the electrical beings that Jerry describes. Okay, let me back up here. Jerry interviews these patients, and he correlates all their auditory, their sensory, their visual hallucinations to give you a better idea of what's going on. And if you apply what we've talked about with aperture, you will see how the amygdala will allow certain sounds to come through, but not visual, and vice versa. And that by doing this, the amygdala is trying to give Jerry more information about what's in reality without Jerry freaking out. And Jerry himself had some experiences where he was with a patient, really telling story of an electrical interaction that happened where a trash can next to him, a metal trash can next to him, starts to buzz from this guy, and the guy didn't know that he could hear it. It's a profound story. You should check it out. But the point is that these hallucinations aren't hallucinations. First of all, they don't meet the definition of hallucination. And second of all, sometimes They're co-created. It means more than one person's having them at the same time. Turns out meth heads have a very wide aperture. There's something about crystal meth that just opens that aperture wide up, which is actually why they end up dying, because the throttle, that pure gas, the adrenaline of what they're seeing is too much for them to handle. We have symptoms of schizophrenia. We call them positive and negative. We'll say hallucinations, we'll say disorganized speech, we'll say a lack of initiative, we'll say reduced speech, but what you're really looking at is realities conflicting. That one person's reality is not another person's reality, but if that person is surrounded by others who say that's not your reality, that person is going to have symptoms that the people who think objective reality exists, they will call those symptoms schizophrenia. But if you are not able to find a human to help you regulate about something you're seeing, that person is going to call you delusional. And if you are not able to find a person to help you regulate what you're hearing or witnessing, that person will call you hallucinatory. They will call you schizophrenic. And when we look at how we treat schizophrenia right now, we don't treat it. We're in complete denial about what to do about it. We call treating schizophrenia patient compliance, medication, and psychotherapy. What is patient compliance? You don't know reality, we do. Patient says yes, give them the pill. That's how we do it. That's how archaic we are right now. It's ridiculous. Meanwhile, shamanism proves aperture. That there are cultures that will value and hold high the shaman because the shaman is quite simply able to perceive things that others are not. That this information that they have is vital for the tribe, and they look up to the shaman. They don't fill them full of drugs. Something else you might find interesting is albinism. What is albinism? Albinism is the lack of melanin. Yeah. Turns out that shamans in Africa had a preponderance to be albinos. That this lack of pigment was something that was causing them pain. Why? Because it was pure gas pedal, no brake. Their body thinks that they had melanin, thinks it was secreting melanin, but it never actually happened. Which means the amygdala thinks, oh, he's not going to be able to handle this crazy energy over here, so I'm going to throw in some melanin. Oh, good, he's probably fine now. Meanwhile, the patient sees it all. He sees it all. Most shamans are typically, as I said before, will be these albinos in African culture. These people are tortured. They have the shittiest lives because they're seeing things others aren't. They're surrounded by people who say they have psychosis when you're brought up in a Western culture. Sometimes they're revered. And it's funny because you see studies of people that will find a schizophrenic and revere him, and suddenly the patient gets better. Albinism isn't even just limited to Africa. That, believe it or not, the story of Noah, people think that Noah was probably an albino. In fact, this phrase that Noah was righteous in his generation, believe it or not, a lot of people think means that he was an albino. And that if you were to take these principles of aperture like we are describing, that you could see how some sort of extraterrestrial, supernatural, interterrestrial, it could even be supernatural being, would only be able to be perceived by someone who did not have the brakes so strong. That you would want someone that's able to handle the frequency of something so massively powerful that it would terrify anyone else and make them freeze or make them not see it at all. Think of fainting goats. Here's a paper. There's lots of these. It's just one. The coexistence of oculocutaneous albinism with schizophrenia. It's basically correlating those two. Now, in this paper, it's not going to necessarily say it's because of what James says, but if you even look here, it's previously hypothesized schizophrenia could be caused by a deficit of melatonin metabolism leading to increased melanin production and the production of hallucinogenic agents. So science even understands that melanin is related to consciousness. that these melanin receptors are places where they should not be when it comes to skin pigments. In fact, inside your brain, there's neuromelanin. Inside your brain, there is dopamine. And there are certain parts of your brain that are darker than others. Why? Because there's so much dopamine there, which is so important for people to perceive. This is in your pons. This is in your reptilian brainstem. The center of your triune brain is the lizard brain. And all of your 12 cranial nerves go there. Actually, they go there in the mammalian brain, to be fair. It's like half and half. But they don't go to this reasoning cortex brain of Mr. Captain. It's like, I understand everything. We're going to circumcise everybody because sanitation is important. And it brings us to ritual abuse. And Rasputin on the left and the Sundance ritual on the right. Rasputin was famous for putting himself through extreme pain and calling it salvation. But what was really happening was this pain was trauma dilating him. That Rasputin was able to dilate himself just as the Sundance ritual of Native Americans who would place hooks into their chest and hang from the pole all day long and stare at the sun. Because this ritual torture was opening their aperture more than it had ever gone. And if you look at Rasputin's eyes, you can see just a glimpse of that in there. Just a glimpse of it. And Rasputin had a whole bunch of strange habits. Some of them sexual, some of them psychotropic, some of them ritual, as I said, ritual trauma stuff. But all of these things led people to believe that in the presence of Rasputin, he had this gift of vision. The charisma that dripped off that motherfucker was so strong precisely because of the ritual dilation that he was putting himself through, that he had complete control over his polyvagal system simply because he was putting himself under so much duress that it was capable of going faster than the average person without needing that melanin break to slow it down. Same with the Sundance ritual. In fact, dilation rituals in general across the board, whether it be a village in Africa or a movie like The Exorcist or a pandemic like COVID, that these dilation rituals, war, 9/11, that these traumas, as much as you want to say trauma is evil, which is fine, I have no problem with you saying that, trauma also is going to lead to the dilation. Flowers are going to open, They're going to open, not close. Which is hard for some of us to understand. What is war but a dilation ritual? Same thing. And that we go through these things and we recover and we come back and we either see more or we have psychosis because everyone calls us crazy. Strabismus and Schizophrenia. Believe it or not, cross-eyed. There's these different types of cross-eyedness: esotropia, exotropia, hypertropia. If you study this phenomenon, you'll read, while doctors have known that many people with schizophrenia have vision problems, only recently have studies showed that children with one type of strabismus are more likely to develop schizophrenia later in life. And that's because the retinas are seeing more than they should. They're seeing so much more that you're seeing this cockeyedness show up as a direct result. And all we do is call them schizophrenic. Oh, they're fucking nuts. They're seeing more than we're seeing. That's what it is. And that's why two meth heads will describe the same shadow figure hanging out in the same tree at the same time. Have a conversation with it. That's why in Jerry, one of his cases, the guy's able to go all the way to Oregon and dig up a treasure or buy drugs from this guy in a park he never knew. There's information that you have that you don't know you have. And if you knew you had it, it might freak you out so much that you're able to decide, you know what, I'm not going to show it to him. Because that guy's going to freak out. He's not going to like it at all. But there's more. Parkinson's has a strong corollary with dopamine and schizophrenia problems. And what is Parkinson's? It comes with hallucinations, dementia, delirium, psychosis, all of these things. We're calling them hallucinations. But the only requirement that makes them hallucinations is that we don't agree. That's literally the only thing. Like I said, your reality is a perturbation coming through a central needle. That needle is rendering it all. There is source, and that source enters the prism. And after it enters, it is split into your different senses and broadcast down to where you think that you're perceiving vision and hearing and sensation, when actually you perceived all of them in an omnidirectional signal, an EMF, called source. And these perturbations, these original perturbations come through, and that is the true light of reality. And that amygdala holds up these silhouettes to show you the shadows on the wall of the cave because your captain is too elementary to handle the light of the sun. That his fidelity is so much that it is required that we only show him the shadows of reality that we have, not the entire picture. This is Plato's cave. And the cones and the rods are not facing out, they're facing in. They are embedded in the retinal pigment epithelium. And that embeddedness is completely regulated by melanin. This is Plato's cave. This is Plato's cave. You have 2 Pavlovian drool balls. That's the truth of it all. That your Pavlovian drool balls, if you know the story of Pavlovian, that before a dog gets a treat, a bell is rung. This is repeated over and over again. And now the bell's rung and the dog drools. No treat. It's a response based on an input that's expected, not an input that's perceived. And that's the big difference. Most of reality you have is expected. Why? Because it's already been perceived in your first eye. It's simply rendered later. Most of reality is wearing a costume for you. It's wearing a costume because you will freak out too much if it doesn't have one on. And your amygdala will dress these things in the most comfortable, obvious, and safe way it can to where you can see them. And some will see a Sasquatch, some will see an alien, some will see a demon, but all 3 of them are perceiving real energy through EMF perturbations that are happening inside the pineal, which are then passing through the amygdala saying, hey, I want to show James this weird etheric rainbow creature from the dimension of Thoth. And the amygdala's like, no, he's not gonna deal with that. But if you put this on him and this on him and this on him, if you call him a Sasquatch, it's going to be more comfortable for him. Why? Because others have had this. He's going to feel a little bit safer about it. It's costumes to keep us safe, but also to show us reality as much as possible. Costumes. Even animals. You see a fox and you think the fox is just right there, but actually that fox is as large as your vision foresees him. That the moment you see a fox from 100 yards away, you're touching that fox already. That the true essence and being of that fox is as far as the rods and cones will perceive that fox to be, because that's where the fox physically is. And you're the same way. You will spot a person 17 miles away. When you're looking off a mountain, you will maybe see a small figure down in the valley walking. You will see that because you're seeing something more than a body. You're seeing an emanation. And this emanation is so large, if it showed the whole thing to you, you would have no spatial recognition around you, because the witness of other people would be so bright, it would burn out all the other light, just like the aperture. You wouldn't know what color the shirt is. You wouldn't know if he had a mustache or not. Costumes. The Eye of Shiva. Shiva is called Triyambaka, Trinayeta, the three-eyed god. And the story goes, one day Shiva's wife, Parvati, playfully placed her hands over Shiva's eyes. Suddenly darkness engulfed the whole world, and all beings trembled in great fear as the Lord of the universe had closed his eyes. Suddenly, a massive eye of flame erupted from the forehead of Shiva. The third eye had appeared there, and this gave light to the world. The truth is right there. Genesis 32:30, and Jacob called the name of this place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Exodus 30:20, and he said, thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. Right? The amygdala saying, you can't show him God. When he sees God for what God really is, he's going to freak the fuck out. You can't show him that. No. We're not showing him God. Safety. Brings us back to the Black Eye Club and why we originally started this. Pure speculation here, but let's have fun with it. What if there was an injection that you could put in your eye that would prohibit, delay, or shut off the secretion of melanin? You would have one eye that you could see everything, because the occipital lobe would render it to the eye, expecting the melanin to come in and cloud it out, and you would have another eye that keeps you rational. And if you were to undergo this procedure, you would be able to see more than anyone else could, and you would choose which eye you would want that to be in. It would be a bionic eye, because you would be removing the ability for amygdala to filter it. Again, fun speculation, but something to think about. I can't prove that last part. Everything else is provable. In fact, not only is it provable, there's some sources here, which I'll just leave up when we finish. Which, by the way, we are.